because that was the basis of
Well, can I say good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone this evening. Just to introduce myself, John Arbuthnot, the current President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I want to begin by saying thank you to this audience, because many of you have actually attended a number of these discussions and debates that we've had about the referendum issues, and it's good to see you here for the last meeting. And we've invited the audience this time to submit questions, and Magnus Linklater, the chair of the panel, will select these. Have been selected at random. No doubt we won't be able to cover all of them, but many of them will be covered. So thank you for that, and thank you for supporting this enterprise so staunchly. Can I just say, by way of introduction, that from the time that the SNP gained its overall majority in 2011, that election, and a referendum on Scottish independence then became a real possibility, the Royal Society of Edinburgh decided to mark such an important issue by publishing a detailed account that would enlighten the constitutional debate. Now, that work began more than 18 months ago. And the meetings that have taken place, we've had meetings about 10 topics, and I think probably 13 or 14 meetings in all. Taken a lot of organising. We've had 45 speakers at these events who have given their view of the questions and some of the answers in the issue of the referendum. The prime aim was to have an informed debate covering all the most important aspects, and to do so in a way that would provide a coherent, permanent record for the future, and that is what has been done in the production of the book, which is released today, and I'm delighted that you have collected your copies of the book. We were joined in this task, I'm pleased to say, by the British Academy, which is based in London. And to remind you, the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Academy are both independent and non-partisan organisations with a combined fellowship of acknowledged experts that cover all the aspects relevant to this referendum. The partnership that we've had with the British Academy is important because the referendum will have implications for the whole of the UK. And as I said, the book that we are issuing today covers the 10 main areas. We chose these areas at the beginning, more or less at the beginning of the planning period, and they have actually proved to be the areas which people have concentrated on as major areas for clarification in the debates. Meetings have been held in Edinburgh, in Glasgow and Aberdeen, and 3 meetings have been held in the Royal Academy, the British Academy in London. The proceedings, including the question and answer sessions which accompanied these discussions, were released at the time on the websites, and they were recorded as videos, and they were released within 2 to 3 weeks of each meeting, therefore making this, from the very beginning, a very public process that people could interact with. Almost all were open meetings with audiences of well over 100, and almost all of them, like tonight's, were sellouts, which is an indication of the degree of interest among the public in this hugely important matter. So the culmination of the project is the book that we published today, freely available on the internet. Why publish this book? Well, as you have seen, the referendum attracts now almost daily coverage across the media in Scotland and beyond, as it should do. Understandably, much of this is politically driven by claim and counterclaim, but now that's becoming quite fierce and some of it unproductive. So I think it is very important for people to have access to the information they want from experts who are unbiased. What the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Academy have done is to provide non-partisan accounts that clarify the key issues and concerns. And that is what we have done, and we hope that we have added considerably to the value of the debate that's going on. And I'm now going to hand over to Magnus, who will introduce the panel, and he will then take the questions. I have to say that this has been an extremely busy day for us at the Royal Society, and it's not over yet, because I will be leaving early in order to get back to Glasgow, where I have to do a television interview about the book. So I hope you enjoy the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a tremendous condensed information from beginning to end, and I really do urge you to read it because you will learn an enormous amount. Our panelists this evening, most of whom have contributed to the book, are here to provide what I suppose we should regard as a pulling together of some of the main arguments which are examined in detail here. But now I think we're going to try and focus on some of the questions that still hover around this great debate. I'll introduce from left to right Professor Jeremy Peat. He's been a member of the Competition Commission for over 8 years. He's also director of the David Hume Institute, a member of the Board of Scottish Enterprise, and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Royal Zoological Society of Edinburgh. And he tells me, and he assures me, that the pandas are about to mate. How he knows that, I don't know. That's just one of the questions that we may not have time for this evening. And then on my immediate left, Professor John Kay. John Kay chaired the review of UK equity markets and long-term decision-making, which reported to the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills in July 2012. He's a visiting professor of economics at the LSE, a fellow of St John's, Oxford, fellow of the British Academy, fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. You can't get much more qualified than that. Then Professor Sir Ian Diamond, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Aberdeen, held that appointment since the 1st of April 2010, was previously Chief Executive of the Economic and Social Research Council, and before that, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Southampton. Dr. Phillips O'Brien, Reader in Modern History and convener of the Global Security Network, and Reader in History at the University of Glasgow, where he also directs this Global Security Network. We may find out a bit more about that in the course of this evening. Sounds distinctly sinister. He's published very widely on British and American defence policy in the 20th and 21st centuries, with a particular emphasis on naval questions, which, of course, may become highly relevant. And then on my far right, Professor John Curtis, who has, I think, become known to us all, because throughout the last 18 months, John has been there. He is, I think, now Britain's leading expert on polls and on opinion and surveys, and his view of how this debate has gone, where we now stand, is particularly interesting. Co-director of, he's Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University and research consultant to Nat Sen Scott Sen Social Research, i.e. these contribute to these social attitude surveys, which tell us so much about what people really think. So, in fact, what I'm just going to kick off with, John, if you don't mind, asking a question of my own, which is a very simple but almost impossible question to answer, which is, we've been involved in this debate, John, now for, getting on for 18 months, and certainly this process has gone on for 18 months. Here we stand with only about 5 months to go, how do you judge the state of opinion in Scotland? Because in a curious way, the two sides, the gap between them remains more or less the same as it was at the beginning. Is this because people are still waiting to make up their minds?
No is the short answer to your question. I mean, we have to remember here that this is a subject that Scotland's been debating for about 40 years or so, ever since the first major rise of the SNP in the early 1970s on the back of the slogan, "It's Scotland's oil." Given that, and given also that at least for some, though not all people, this is a question primarily of identity, and either you say, I am Scottish, Scotland is a nation, therefore we should be an independent state, or alternatively you say, I am British, and I wish to remain British, and therefore part of the country I was born into. If you're given that also roots many people's views, we shouldn't be surprised that public opinion has proven rather difficult to shift. I mean, if truth be told, Magnus, certainly before the publication of the Independence White Paper, some of us were going, you know what, unless something changes, this is going to be an extremely dull referendum, because the opinion polls keep on saying the same thing after the same thing after the same thing, and nothing has shifted. Of course, the interesting thing is that since Christmas, there has been a noticeable, though not dramatic, shift, and probably the yes side are now about 3 points better off than they were 3 months ago. And that therefore, as a result, we're now looking at a contest that's around 58% no, 42% yes, rather than one that was about 61-39. That still means, if at least the average of the opinion polls are correct, and the opinion polls are adding their own particular spice to this, because although they suggest that not a great deal has changed, they don't manage to agree with each other about exactly what the level is. So we know not very much has changed, we're just not quite sure how much it's not changed from. But anyway, but apart from that, if we take the average of the opinion polls as being, likely roughly where we are, the yes side have made some progress, but they still have quite some considerable way to go. But shall we say the no side have demonstrated a certain nervousness in the last few weeks, which perhaps is rather remarkable given how stable the polls have been until a few weeks ago.
Well, what is quite clear is that the kind of questions that we're going to come to go to the heart of this. I think the great advantage of this enlightening the constitutional debate is that the RSE is not taking sides in this. There's no specific argument for yes or no here. The aim of the book is to offer evidence, not to persuade, although, of course, the evidence may be persuasive. And the other thing that emerges from it is what Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary, once called known unknowns. Now, known unknowns are things, big questions, which would face an independent Scotland, but which really can't be tested until the event actually happens. And it's remarkable how often that crops up, that evidence can be offered up to a certain point, but then it's up to what happens in reality, in the political reality of a post-referendum Scotland. And by the way, not just in the case of independence, but in the case of a no vote as well. Those questions are equally demanding. However, the first clump of questions we come to are under the heading of currency, banking, financial services, taxation, spending, the economy, all the big questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the question, name the person who's asked the question, and if the person who has asked the question would please stick up his, in this case, his hand, then I'll turn to him for a supplementary question if he's not entirely satisfied with the answer. And this is Stephen Nisbet. Stephen Nisbet, who's right there in the middle. Are there any valid grounds for thinking that the refusal by the three main UK parties to contemplate a formal currency union is bluff, as the SNP maintains, and that they would change their minds after a yes win at the referendum? On balance, would it be in the rest of the UK's self-interest for them to do so? And the man on my left is the perfect person to answer that, John Kay.
Thank you, Magnus. I think the simple answer to that question is yes, it is bluff. And the reason I think that is that actually the status quo is one in which we have one currency across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And it's not apparent that anything need upset that particular status quo. When we debated this in the seminars that Sir John described, we described that as it were, the unilateral option. And we didn't find it very attractive at that time. Certainly I thought then, and I think now, that the best outcome would be in which there were negotiations about future monetary and fiscal arrangements, and particularly about monetary arrangements between Scotland and the remaining UK. I thought it would be difficult to reach an agreement, but I think that would be the plan. At this point, these three parties are saying, well, we would not engage in that negotiation at all. And I don't think that's any more a tenable position than it is for the Scottish government to have said, as it did at the end of last year, that we could unilaterally determine what the terms of a monetary union are. If Scotland wants to go on using the pound sterling, then I think Alex Salmond was right when he said, well, actually, the pound is every bit as much Scotland's currency as it is England's currency. And if one asks, could we continue to use the pound after independence if we wanted to do so? I think there is very little that could be done to make Scotland stop. The unilateral option, in short, is a viable alternative. And that means any sensible governments on either side of the Scotland-England border are going to negotiate after a yes vote on how they actually manage their monetary and fiscal affairs in the new situation.
That's quite a momentous answer in a way. Jeremy Peat, do you go along with it?
Can I just start by saying that I think it is in the interests of the rest of the UK and Scotland that in the event of independence there is a wholly stable currency arrangement, in the sense that whatever currency Scotland is using should be stable against sterling, whether it be identical or not. That is in everybody's interest, because that would mean no transaction costs, no risks, no uncertainties. And there is such an interlinking between the two economies that having uncertain exchange rates and transaction costs would be bad on both sides. It would be far worse for Scotland than for the rest of the UK, because something like 60% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK, which is a much higher percentage than is the case for the rest of the UK's exports to Scotland. So I want, in the event of independence, there to be a stable relationship, so that whether it's called sterling or something else, that there is no uncertainty. Now, there are three ways of achieving that. One is to have the currency union, and I do agree that that is not wholly implausible. That probably is some way it could be done. And I think the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, when he was said to have ruled it out, I think he ruled it out as presently constituted, which I think leaves a little bit of scope for debate. The other way of doing it is the use of sterling independently, which John is now advocating, which would be a great experiment. It's only been done in the past by small and relatively weak countries using the dollar or whatever in a way that no one really worries about and they get on with. To do it in a country like Scotland would be an experiment, and I would want to be utterly convinced that it can be done without there being major risks that the currency markets would attack it or whatever, and also without the risk that it would cost a huge amount in terms of the tight monetary policy would be required, the cost of borrowing that would be required to achieve it. So I would want that option explored far more fully, and I'm glad John is advocating it, because that means it will be explored more fully. And given it now appears to be the plan B of the Scottish Government, I think it's right it be explored more fully, and one sees where it were. The third option is to have an independent currency tied to sterling, which would be quite resource intensive and again quite uncertain. So I'm sure one of those options makes sense in the event of independence, and if the option John is now describing can be made to work, fine, but I need more evidence before I'm persuaded.
Just before I come back to Mr. Nisbet, one of the arguments I thought that emerged from this on this particular topic was that a Scottish, I think it's called sterlingization, is that right? Would be highly vulnerable to the international markets. I mean, Jeremy's touched on that. What's your view on that?
I think the attraction of the sterlingization is actually that it's not vulnerable to speculation on international monetary markets, because if there is no separate Scottish currency, there is no currency for speculators to speculate against. That's a very large advantage of that particular arrangement. And for me, it may well be a decisive argument against the alternative of the currency peg, because having a currency peg does depend on having foreign exchange reserves with which you can defend your currency against speculative attack. If one looks at examples of very successful currency pegs, the two striking ones are Hong Kong, which has been pegged to the US dollar for 30 years, or the Danish kroner, which has been pegged to the euro since the formation of the Eurozone. The point in both these cases is that these countries have currencies that would actually have both foreign exchange reserves and currencies that would be likely to appreciate against the euro or the dollar respectively if the peg were to be abandoned. In that case, there is no difficulty defending that peg. Scotland could not expect to be in that position. The reserves that Scotland could expect to inherit from the breakup of the UK are as meagre in terms of global currency markets today as the UK's reserves are meagre in relation to global currency markets today. And therefore it would be difficult to defend the peg. Unilateral adoption of the sterling means the only thing that international currency markets can speculate against is sterling.
I mean, it's a lovely, neat thesis, but one then has to worry a little bit about the banks and the financial institutions. Do they then all get based in the rest of the UK and overseen and managed by the rest of the UK, and the Scottish end is just a branch entity? Does that apply to Standard Life as well as to RBS? That's one area that one has to worry about. And John says there's nothing that can be attacked, but there has to be this belief by all involved that it will endure. There has to be a commitment that this is not just for tomorrow, but for an extended period. And that, I think, is something that has to be looked at, because there have been statements by various parties that in due course there may be a movement to an independent currency. Now, if that is expected to be within a foreseeable period, then I think there can be a risk to the arrangements. So I don't think as yet we have it 100% proven that this can work, especially as there are no prior examples for any significant countries where it has worked.
Well, there's another view of that, which says right, we have evidence that it's worked. In particular, the evidence is that it's worked for the last 300 years. The question has to become why it's not going to work in future.
Mr. Nisbet, do you want to follow up on your question?
Just simply to ask whether, if this is going down the road of sterlingization rather than continuation of the monetary union as it is now, would the English public opinion tolerate the continuation of the present arrangement? Because I've read in the paper recently, somebody said, English public opinion would crucify the three unionist parties which have set their sights publicly so far, so clearly against the continuation of the status quo.
Well, I think we need to answer that question by asking what public opinion or the Westminster government is actually going to do about it.
Can I come in on that?
Yes.
The short answer to you is that the currency intervention has proved remarkably more successful at changing public opinion south of the border than it has done north of the border. One of the things that's now quite clear is that in the wake of the currency intervention, public opinion in England and Wales now isn't terribly keen on the idea of showing the pound, whereas beforehand it didn't seem to think very much about it either way. That actually is linked to a wider trend. If you go back 2 or 3 years ago, you could find opinion polls in which there was quite widespread sympathy, seemingly in England and Wales, for the idea of Scotland becoming independent if that's what it wanted to do. People did not necessarily think that Scotland leaving the UK would be bad news to the rest of the UK. There is now a widespread impression south of the border that Scotland leaving the UK would be bad news for the rest of the UK. Therefore, support for independence has fallen, and certainly in line with that, they're now less keen on the idea of sharing the pound with Scotland. So, to that, but the point about all of that is that public opinion south of the border is potentially movable, and almost undoubtedly it is what it is currently, because of the position adopted by the politicians. If the politicians were to adopt a different position, one suspects that public opinion south of the border will also be capable of being shifted back in the other direction.
Now, if anybody, in the course of this discussion, if anybody in the audience has a very, very important additional question to ask on this particular one, don't hesitate to stick your hand up, and I'll come to you. And there's no hesitation there. So could you, is there a microphone? There we are.
Well, my first thought on the notion of it's just bluff is if we can't believe what our Chancellor says, his shadow and our politicians and governments say about something as important as this, who can we believe, and how can we make an informed choice when we go and vote? Is it right for our politicians to play dice like that with the Constitution and with the future of the country? Would be my first observation to the idea that they are just bluffing as though it's just a general election or some other political manoeuvre.
Very good question. Who would like to answer it?
I think perhaps Sir John should answer it, because that is precisely what organisations like the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh are for, to be willing to try and investigate and find out the truth in the middle of a political dialogue that is polarised as a result of people wanting, understandably to some degree, to take positions in advance of a hotly contested vote.
Yeah, I mean, can I be charitable to politicians for just a moment? I think the truth. I mean, look, the truth is that most of the characters involved in this drama on the UK side do have history. The Treasury has a history of not being very keen on joining the euro. Ed Balls has a very clear history of not being in favour of the euro. George Osborne has a history of being extremely reluctant of being in any kind of position for bailing out anybody else's banks. The only person whose position looks a little less secure is that of Danny Alexander, given he was the former press officer for the pro-Euro campaign. But otherwise, apart from that, I mean, I think the truth is that I think neither George Osborne nor Ed Balls would want to have a monetary union with Scotland if they could possibly avoid it. But equally also, they certainly don't want Scotland to vote yes. Therefore, given those two motivations, don't be surprised if they give us a very hard message. Now, I think, ironically, one of the mistakes they made was to fail to realise that their previous pronouncements, and they'd already said things about this before February, had already got through. And in fact, it was already the case that less than half the people in Scotland thought that in the event of independence, Scotland would necessarily be able to keep the pound as part of a monetary union anyway. So one of the reasons why the intervention didn't work is that you weren't telling people in Scotland something they hadn't suspected wasn't already the case anyway.
Can I just put a slightly different gloss on what I think the position is, which is that anything within reason is negotiable. But I believe that if post a yes vote there were to be negotiations between the Bank of England, Treasury and the Scotland over a currency union, there would be huge constraints placed on Scotland as to what limitations there would be on independence of economic policies in the event of moving to a currency union. So I think I quote John correctly as saying, any deal that would be on the table will be one that no self-respecting nationalist would deign to accept. So I think that's what you said a few months ago.
Paraphrases a little.
I thought it was very neat, because so I give it to you as a quote. So I think that, of course, there may be some scope for discussion, but there's a very firm view that the conditions that would have to be so tight that the actual extent of independence of economics policy that was left over for Scotland might be de minimis, which is why John's idea of the sterlingisation is quite neat, because it allows it to continue without negotiation, and there may be a way forward. But it's just, at the moment, a little too neat for me, and I need to find out what's wrong with it.
I think that's right, that sterlingisation, is a world in which Scotland would have no freedom in terms of monetary policy at all. But the reality is that there is no outcome in which Scotland would have very substantial freedom over its monetary policy. So the sacrifice that is being made to achieve that result is not one that is very large. Much of this debate actually exaggerates greatly, in many cases, the amount of economic independence that a small country like Scotland could actually enjoy in a modern global world.
Even with an independent currency, very tight monetary policy would be required, very tight fiscal policy because of the extent of dependence on a volatile revenue source. The amount of independence will be limited, at least for the first few years, in any independent state.
Probably pretty well summed up by the Governor of the Bank of England when he came up before George Osborne.
Yes.
I thought he put it in a pretty well-balanced way.
It's well worth rereading what he said.
He put it in a much more measured way, and that's his job, of course, than the interpretation the Chancellor subsequently put on it.
That's politicians for you. There was one urgent question at the back.
Thank you. I was just surprised that no one had mentioned the Czech and Slovak experience, because my understanding was they aimed to have a monetary union and it fell apart. And there the currency would have been impossible to tell. There'd be the same notes. But actually in Scotland's case, presumably if you had Scottish banknotes, a view could be taken about Scottish banknotes by the international markets. I'd ask the panel to consider that and the experience of the Czechs and Slovaks.
Only a percentage of the notes circulating in Scotland will be Scottish notes. So if the two currencies were to be divided, as happened very rapidly with the Czech and Slovak example, then just as in Czechoslovakia, in the two parts, there would have to be stamps on the notes circulating in the two areas, because the Bank of England notes would be the majority in circulation in Scotland as well as in England. But of course, Czech and Slovakia were very different in their structural differences than is the case with Scotland and the rest of the UK.
At one of these seminars we held in London, we actually brought along a Slovak to tell us about the Czechoslovakian experience. And perhaps the key feature of that was that actually the two parts of Czechoslovakia didn't decide anything at all. They decided the currency issue was something they could sort out afterwards. And that was the source of the problem. They couldn't sort it out afterwards because within 6 weeks the arrangement broke up. I think the one lesson for us is don't do that again. Right. What was also important to this was that it was plain that the Slovak economy was much weaker than the Czech economy, with the result that when the two currencies did separate, the Slovak crown immediately went to a 20 to 25% discount to the Czech crown. That's also not something which would be true in the Scottish case.
But I think the Slovakian economy has recovered pretty well.
Yes, it was a good idea for the Slovakian economy to have that devaluation.
By the way, this is the kind of question that he's gone into in some detail in this, so that if you want to plunge more into the Slovak issue, this is the place to do so. I've got another question here from George Peden, which can he identify himself? which I'm going to read out, if you don't mind, and slightly specialist question, but actually extremely important. Even if an independent Scotland successfully negotiated a currency union with the rest of the UK and the Bank of England acted as the union's central bank, would it be advisable for the Scottish Government to have an independent source of banking advice? For example, could a new bank be created in Edinburgh from Scotland's percentage of government shares in RBS and Lloyds? Jeremy Heat.
Yeah, I had the great pleasure of spending 12 years as Group Chief Economist at RBS, leaving in 2005. So, I don't know why I always mention that, but and I think that there are 2 points, George, if I may say, which you've conflated slightly first. One is whether Scotland should have a central bank, and I think first of all, it may be a requirement under EU law for any member state of the European Union to have a central bank, in which case that may be necessary. But I think also, whatever the situation, there probably is a need, whether regulation is done down south, whether monetary policy is run down south, whatever, for having some institution that is independent, that operates some form of oversight and advice to the government. I'm a great believer in bodies like that, and the Office of Budget Responsibility is important as having an arm's length set of arrangements. So I think something of that sort would be needed. So far as the banking sector per se is concerned, my expectation would be that any major banking organisation would be likely to move, if they haven't already moved their head offices, to the rest of the UK. And I'm not too worried about that, because already the basic decision-making of RBS, HBOS, Lloyds is undertaken elsewhere, and the purchases of high-quality services happens elsewhere. So we've lost all those major multiplier effects that used to happen when RBS and HBOS or Bank of Scotland were head officed here. So I'm not too worried about that loss, but what we do need to have in Scotland is a competitive and efficient banking sector, providing the necessary services to households and to companies across Scotland. That can be via RBS branches and services continuing as they do now, likewise Lloyds, HBOS, HSBC, but I would also like to see encouraged a proliferation of smaller banking organisations, like we have coming now with Virgin and Tesco. There are other small banks that I hope would grow, so that we had what we haven't had for many years in Scotland, which is a truly competitive banking sector for households and for small and medium-sized companies. I don't particularly worry if the investment banks aren't here. In fact, I'm rather pleased if they're not here. They can go with their risks and play elsewhere, provided we have those fundamental services that companies and household needs, and access to the higher level services that very large companies need available somewhere. That can be provided. So I think that, yes, let's have some form of central banking organisation, but small and neat and there to provide advice and a degree of oversight. But let's encourage a proliferation of competitive banks based here or elsewhere, which provide those services that are so important.
Just to follow up on that, do you George Osborne's speech was followed up by a statement from Standard Life,
yeah,
which talked about moving its headquarters south in the event of independence. Do you see that as a wholesale shift in the event that Scotland votes yes, that there would be a shift out of particularly of Edinburgh, of headquarters?
Well, what I would emphasise, Magnus, is that since the debacle of RBS and HBOS, the financial services sector in Edinburgh and Scotland has remained really very strong and vibrant. Not because of the banks, but because of other elements. Yeah. Our fund managers, our life insurers, the like.
And
I want them to
continue.
Well, I do hope so. Yeah. That to me is far more of a worry than the position on the banks. Yeah. What's happened on the banks has happened, and I just worry about the services. But I would like the major fund managers, the major insurers to feel they can operate here effectively. And that's what I would like to see, that the arrangements are in place for them to be confident and comfortable that they continue to have their major head offices here, so that we get the benefit of all that goes with big head offices. And there are uncertainties about that, but I think that, to me, is a critical feature.
Mr. Peden, do you want to follow up on your question?
Oh, I can see that the Scottish Government would get very good advice from the David Hume Institute.
Whether it will listen is another matter. Yes, there's a microphone here.
Banks these days are rather too big to fail. The banks we have are of a size that the UK government can prop them up, just barely, but are perhaps too big to be propped up by the Scottish government in the event of independence. Does this mean that we would need to break up the banks, and would that be a bad thing or perhaps an advantage of independence?
Again, I think, Jeremy, you're going to have to...
Well, I'm sure John will have something to add. I personally believe that inevitably there will be no huge, ginormous banks headquartered in Scotland. It would not work. But I repeat that there's no reason why we can't have the services that are required for our communities provided within Scotland. There may be a branch office, but I'm not down on branch offices, providing they are customer focused, they're relationship banks, they know what they're doing. And alongside those, there can be this proliferation of smaller organisations. I mean, the Edinburgh Savings Bank is a classic example of a really successful institution. Why aren't there 20 Edinburgh Savings Bank? Let Tesco, let Virgin, let them all grow alongside branch offices of some major institutions. Different types of organisations, credit unions as well. Let's have different types of banking organisation providing a variety of services, some headquartered here, some elsewhere, but avoiding the risks that are associated, which Scotland could not face, of having a jumbo bank head office here that is too big to fail, as you suggest.
Well, let's remind ourselves what the major Scottish banks are today. The Royal Bank of Scotland, 82% owned by the UK taxpayer. They're the Lloyds Banking Group, and they're the Clydesdale Bank, which is part of the National Australia Bank Group. Is the Scottish Government going to bail out National Australia Bank, Lloyds Bank, or the 82% UK taxpayer-owned Royal Bank of Scotland? Of course not. Right, the worst argument I've heard in this whole independence debate is the one that says you need very big countries so that you can find lots of money to bail out banks. There needs to be a better solution to that problem than that answer. And there is a better solution, which is to say that bailing out banks is not something that the Scottish Government does anymore. And the sooner other governments get that message, the better it would be, in my opinion.
Just before I come to you, are you by any chance Philip Wadler? You've just asked the question, which I had on my list, but we've disposed of that. Yes. There's a microphone just to your right.
Yeah, I mean, if I may make a very quick aside to the lady who said, if we can't trust George Osborne, who can we trust? I would suggest throwing a dart at a phone book might well give you a practicable answer. Well, George Osborne is currently the Chancellor. I wouldn't, given some of the scare stories, I would not trust the politicians to be telling you the truth, because we know in so many occasions that they're not doing so. I would, when you're talking about the headquarters, you could possibly explain, am I correct in saying that the headquarters of a big financial institution are not necessarily where the major employment takes place? Because if the Royal Bank, for instance, had to replicate Gogarburn in London, and the human resource of Gogarburn, the cost would be astronomical compared to keeping them in Edinburgh. So you can easily put a plaque on a wall or something slightly more grand than that and still retain the employment benefits of the large financial institutions in Scotland. And on the negotiating point, if it's accepted that Scotland's share of the assets of the UK, including the sterling assets, are negotiable in proportion to the share of the UK debt, then surely that's where the negotiations will take place. It will take place on what assets are achieved compared to what debt repayment is agreed.
I mean, 2 points there. I agree that if, and this is actually a reflection of what I've just been saying, this should not be about brass plates. The most curious idea in the whole banking debate has been the idea that if you stick up a brass plate in a country saying our bank is headquartered here, there is then an obligation on the taxpayers of that country to pay off the creditors of a bank concerned if it fails. That's plainly a ludicrous proposition. But if people believe that proposition, then whatever country is willing to go along with that belief is going to attract an awful lot of bank brass plates. I'm very determined it shouldn't be Scotland.
If I can just add one other point, Chairman, which is that I'm very happy that there would be a continuation of major employment at Gogarburn. I think that's right. But what I want to see happen is that we don't just get low value-added, low-skilled jobs across financial institutions in Scotland. I want the higher value-added jobs, and I want the purchase of major services of accountants, of lawyers, of actuaries, of chartered surveyors, whatever, to take place across Scotland. So one has those high-level service, business and financial service sectors available for other companies, growing companies. If you have all the decision-making taking place in London for all financial services companies with just branch offices here, the risk is you get a proliferation of low value-added, low-skilled jobs, and you don't get this generation of momentum within the economy from having the high-skilled jobs here, based here, rather than coming up on planes from London occasionally. So it's not just jobs, it's quality of jobs, and having that external effect on the rest of the business and financial service sector. That's what I want to see happen.
And that's a hugely important point, that over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen the migration of the top-level headquarters activities of large companies out of Scotland, whether we're talking about the disappearance of distillers into Diageo, or the takeover of Scottish and Newcastle breweries, etc. And the tragedy of 2008 was that the 2 largest remaining organisations which did have their principal headquarters activities located in Scotland were RBS and HBOS. And what has now happened is the organising, dominating, strategic thinking in these organisations has now moved to London.
Indeed.
And that's really bad news for Scotland and the Scottish economy, and is irrevocable.
John Curtis, I just want to pick up on the lady's point there about the Chancellor and politicians in general. Do you think that there is a sort of slightly mutinous quality beginning to appear amongst the Scottish electorate, whereby the accumulation of these dire warnings, is actually turning opinion, the other way?
Yes, I mean, there is a risk. Let me just make one other point first, since having been nice to politicians. I mean, I think one of the things that emerges very clearly out of the discussions this evening is that in truth there's been a little bit of a conspiracy of silence on both sides about the banking issue. So on the one hand, George Osborne says, well, one of the reasons why I don't want monetary union is I don't want to be on the UK taxpayer to be on the line for bailing out Scottish banks. To which the answer is, what Scottish banks? Because the truth is that for the foreseeable future, Scotland's banking system is going to be headquartered in London. But equally, of course, the yes side cannot come out and say, George, that's a silly argument because we won't have any banks, because they don't wish to face up to the reality that an independent Scotland will not have any banks. So there's a case where, as it were, both sides are in effect failing to face up to the reality, which is that irrespective of whether Scotland's independent or not, it no longer has its own banking system. But anyway, which then, in a sense, leads me into the point that you're trying to make, Magnus. I think the truth is, I would say that to work, these arguments that says things are risky, that things are going to go wrong, etc., they first of all have to appear credible. And credibility helps if, for example, they're coming from a source that people trust. And the truth is that in Scotland, people don't trust bankers. They don't trust Conservatives. So the idea that therefore a Tory Chancellor comes north to tell us that we can't have monetary union because he's been told that by bankers is not necessarily the most convincing and credible way of selling a political argument. And then the second thing, and I think one of the things, the reasons why this debate got into trouble from the no side, is you then ask the follow-up question, and the follow-up question is, okay, so if Scotland can't keep the pound, all right, but it still does vote yes, what do you then think should happen? And the truth is that the no side don't give us the same answer. I mean, I think, certainly I'm absolutely clear that Jackson Carlaw, the deputy leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, thinks that in those circumstances, as a Scottish politician, he should be arguing for monetary union. His leader, Ruth Davidson, thinks we should be arguing for a separate currency. And I think it's pretty clear that on the one hand, Danny Alexander is the most clearest advocate for Scotland having its own currency that not even Patrick Harvey can make quite so clearly. So Danny Alexander's answer to the question is, well, we definitely need our own currency if we vote yes. On the other hand, it seems pretty clear that actually Alistair Darling actually thinks, well, if Scotland is silly enough to vote yes, then it should still be trying to sue for monetary union. So there's a problem about credibility, therefore, because the truth is you ask the next question, what should happen, and you don't get the same answer from that side. And the truth at the end of the day, I mean, the lesson from John and Jeremy has been fantastic. But at the end of the day, the reason why this Chancellor gave the speech was not because of the sage advice of the Governor of the Bank of England. It was a belief that if you tell people in Scotland that if they didn't vote no, they would lose the pound, they were so desperately attached symbolically to this currency in their pocket that they would go off and vote no. And the truth is that what we have discovered is that Scotland is not so symbolically attached to the pound, that it's therefore, as a result, automatically going to go off and vote no. And given the problems of credibility around the argument, the truth is actually, at the moment, the most recent polling evidence is that more people think that Osborne is bluffing than not. So the truth is, it ain't worked. It was probably a bad idea in the first place. It was poorly executed, and people didn't think about what was the follow-up question.
Hence the fury at the anonymous minister quoted in The Guardian who said, well, of course we'll do a deal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that then, obviously helped to undermine the case because they were still trying to convince us position. Well, then somebody says, well, hang on, look, maybe at the end of the day we will need to have to trade monetary union for trade. Now, of course, again, we come back to the conspiracy of silence because the SNP are not willing, specifically at least, to say that they would be willing to engage in such a trade, although I know Philip here thinks that actually there are subtle signals out there that they might be willing to do so. We might want to come back to that later on.
I mean, I don't think Osborne is lying. He's just saying that's his position, but in negotiations, all positions change. And I think it would be very odd to say any position is not negotiable. They said this is what we would like, and we don't want Scotland to have the
I think
pound.
he was putting it harder than that, wasn't he?
But it's not law. It's a stated position. We've seen many stated positions change over the course of this campaign. I mean, really quite marked changes. Of course, it's a negotiating position which they think will have a short-term political impact on the referendum. And then if it doesn't have that impact on the referendum, then it's a negotiating position to bring you after independence.
But Magnus, if there is a yes vote, all bets are off, you start again. You then look at what the currency story is. You don't say that everything that happened before the referendum is prescribing what will happen on the currency afterwards. You then start and see what the way forward can be.
Yes, but it's still tantamount to his bluffing. We've got a question here from Michael Brown there, which is quite a technical question, but actually very important because it's about pensions. Having spent my entire working life overseas, my pension is paid by an international company headquartered in London, which has no presence in Scotland. Income tax is deducted at source. In the event of separation, if I choose to retain my United Kingdom nationality with a domicile of choice in Scotland, will my pension continue to be taxed in England or in Scotland? I am so glad I am not answering that question. Gentlemen.
I think the basic answer is there is an immense amount of detail about independence which would fall to be negotiated, which is actually one of the reasons why the idea that you can have an 18-month timetable for independence is wholly unrealistic. The likely answer to your question is that it would be taxed in Scotland. But if you're looking for easy or flip answers to any of these questions, I would respond that the experience of the breakup of Czechoslovakia over 20 years ago has already been mentioned, and the pensions issue between the two countries remains a matter of contention to this day.
Gosh, that won't make people feel more comfortable, will it? Would you have any follow-up question to that?
Thank you for the answer, but I think it just leaves it open, as you say, to subsequent negotiations in the event of a yes vote.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just an intervention on the tax issue. The UK law is very clear that a non-dom doesn't pay tax, and that's a person whose domicile is other. Tax is based on residence. So a person resident in Scotland does not pay tax in the rest of the UK. I think that the precedent on that is very clear. What's confusing, the issue is that the source of the income is based in the rest of the UK. But
I think we have at the
doesn't
moment
matter.
rules in the UK on residence and domicile which are clearly not sustainable in the event of the breakup which we're describing. I look forward very much, having been born in Scotland, having been brought up and educated in Scotland, but now residing principally in England, I look forward to being classified as a non-dom for purposes of UK taxation or English taxation. I do not anticipate that that would in fact be the outcome if Scotland voted for independence.
Right, we've come, I think we've dealt with all the principal questions there that you asked, and we could go on talking about the economy till the cows come home, and many people will, but we're moving on now to the next clump of questions, which is under the general heading of Defence and International Relations, Borders and Immigration, Scotland and the EU. And I'm going to kick off and I'm going to ask, I think almost certainly Dr. O'Brien, if he would respond to Lord Robertson's rather remarkable speech in the United States, where he said that if there was a separation of Scotland from the rest of the UK, it would be, I think he used the word, a cataclysmic event, which will lead to the balkanization of the I don't know, balkanization presumably of Britain and then Europe, i.e. it would begin a process equivalent to the balkanization of Yugoslavia. Dr. O'Brien, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It is an overstatement. I think using the word cataclysm probably was counterproductive for the speech because it simply is too much. What is interesting is it's one of the first times that someone, you might say, speaking for an RUK perspective, a non-independent Scotland perspective, is willing to face the fact that if Scotland leaves, it will have quite profound implications. A lot of what we've heard coming out of London and the South during this debate is, well, if Scotland leaves, the RUK sails on much as before. It maintains the Security Council seat. It would still be a nuclear power. It would still be considered a major world player. And that's partly because that, again, would be a position they would want to take after independence. What Robertson is doing is sort of letting the cat out of the bag that actually, if Scotland leaves, this could have a profound impact on not only the outside view of the RUK, but the RUK's view of itself? At what point do you admit, okay, the British Empire's gone, Second World War is over, you've lost 10% of your population, all your oil reserves, most of your fishing grounds, all of your whiskey. And do you say that what has happened is you've become a mid-ranking international power that needs to give up Trident, get rid of these ridiculous aircraft carriers, and sort of settle into a more comfortable, modest position? Now, if that happens, that has absolutely profound implications. It could lead it could lead to Security Council reform. The entire UN could change, or probably would have to change at that point. At what point does it become ridiculous for the UK to have 1 of 5 seats when it can't stay together? It would have profound implications for NATO, which is why I think what Robertson is playing on is this notion that actually much of the West, what we would call the West, is very skeptical about Scottish independence, that he was speaking to an audience that would endorse his views, speaking in the United States. Most major Western countries don't want to see this happen. In fact, I can't think of one significant Western state that the state would like to see the United Kingdom break up. I don't think there's a single one out there. They view the United Kingdom as an institution that plays quite an important role as the largest European defense power, as a major player in NATO, and sort of all these interlinked roles. And so I think in that sense that the speech was given to an audience that would endorse that, but on the other hand, I think the important thing is it also shows awareness of what could happen after independence.
So what you're saying is something slightly, considerably different, which is that the impact of Scotland separating from the rest of the UK would have quite profound effects on the standing of the United Kingdom, the formerly United Kingdom. We'd have to think of a better name than that, I guess. The kingdom formerly known as United, I guess, might be one possibility, but and the implications would go far wider. George Robson was saying was saying the use of the word balkanization gives rise to the idea that there would be sort of actual conflict.
I think it's more that, and this would happen as how an independent Scotland would be treated in the negotiating process, that if Scotland voted for independence, it would begin this process of negotiating with the EU, negotiating with NATO, and establishing its new position. I think if that process went smoothly, then it would encourage other European separatist groups. Mm. So I think what he's talking about is it's not just if the vote goes for yes, but what happens after the vote and how quickly and seamlessly Scotland could be integrated into the EU or reintegrated to the EU and NATO. Now, therefore, there would be a strong political imperative by certain countries in Europe to make that as difficult and as painful a process, simply not because they care about Scotland, but because they care about their own minority sections, their own regions. And so I think, I think in that sense, he is hitting on a nerve. There are some countries that do see Scottish independence as the thin end of the wedge, and they would try to do everything possible in the negotiating process to make sure that wedge doesn't widen by making it as difficult a process.
Professor Diamond, what was your response when you read that speech?
Let me say very clearly that I haven't read the speech. Right. I listened only to a report of it on a probably less than reputable radio station. Therefore, it did seem to me exactly what has been said, something of an overstatement of the truth.
But it is certainly the case that governments like Spain would look with grave concern.
Sure. No, I mean, this was said in public. I mean, I have heard one senior SNP politician say to his colleagues in a meeting, don't go on about Scotland being a precedent. You will not make life any easier for yourself in the rest of Europe, and not least inside Madrid. I mean, there clearly is a concern, particularly in Madrid, that Catalonia will try to do it off the back. Now, there's a whole different position there, but certainly the Catalan government would like to hold a referendum in November, in the belief that if it can hold a referendum in November off the back of a yes vote in Scotland in September, that as a result, Catalonia may vote yes. So I think that's obviously part of what's being got at by George Robertson. And I suppose, in a sense, his concern is that Europe in general becomes so full of small states that, therefore, as a result, it's not capable of being a significant international player in the way that it would. The problem, however, with this, and I think one of the things that campaigners for now have to bear in mind is that the argument sounds a bit like, please don't claim your birthright because it would make it difficult for us elsewhere. And the difficulty for that is, well, hang on, why should I care about what happens elsewhere? Equally, the Prime Minister is very, very good at articulating the argument as to why having Scotland as part of the United Kingdom is great for the UK as a whole. He's a brilliant, passionate exponent of that view. He's not quite so good at what is arguably the crucial view for most people living in, crucial argument in Scotland, which is why Scotland being in the UK is good for Scotland. And therefore, I think to that extent, at least, it's a rather misdirected argument. I mean, the truth is you have to kind of realise the people who have to vote, have the chance to vote in this referendum are the voters in Scotland, not the voters in London or Barcelona or Madrid or anywhere else in the world.
Dr. O'Brien, just pursuing one of the things you alluded to, on Trident, Trident is probably one of the trickiest issues that, in the event of a yes vote, either country, north or south of the border, will have to grapple with. The Scottish government would have to apply for NATO, but say, by the way, we're abandoning our nuclear position. The rest of the UK would say, where are we going to put our subs? Do you see that as a sort of bargaining chip, or is it just something that there will have to be negotiated over endless months and even years?
Well, I think actually in this case, we can turn to the white paper, which has partially resolved certain issues by being indefinite, if that makes sense. That we've had, the Yes campaign has an enormous tension over Trident, and it's been a real problem. It's been one of their real political thorns. On the one side, you have quite a active, passionate part of the Yes campaign that is motivated by the notion of getting nuclear weapons out of Scotland. You might call it the CND wing, but it goes beyond CND. It's a certain part of the Yes campaign that really believes this is an important issue. By the way, not just to denuclearize Scotland. This would be part of an agenda, I think, to denuclearize the RUK. Scotland's not going to be a nuclear power upon independence. On the other hand, this is the largest employer in an area west of Glasgow that is not a wealthy region. And so you're also left with these jobs at the naval complex, Her Majesty's Naval Base Clyde, which takes in Faslane and Coalport, which employ quite a large part of the region. And therefore, the Yes campaign's been having to dance around this issue. What came out in the white paper, however, was that they chose to be clearly indefinite about getting Trident out. So if you read it closely, what you will see is there is no definite timeline for Trident to be removed from Scotland. What it says is there is a view that they would like Trident to be removed by the end of the first Scottish Parliament term, which would be 2021. But that's just a view. It's not in any way a hard and fast, we will get Trident out by 2021. It's a negotiating position that is less definite than what George Osborne has said about Scotland keeping the currency. So it's that. Secondly, within the white paper, the word non-nuclear is used many times, but it's never defined. Because there are different stages of non-nuclearness. Sort of like being a little bit pregnant, I suppose. But New Zealand being the most pregnant, which has a policy that very clearly states there will be no nuclear weapons on New Zealand soil and in New Zealand waters at any time, which means U.S. warships cannot actually go to New Zealand because U.S. warships do not confirm or deny that they have nuclear weapons on them. What is in the white paper is not a non-nuclear policy like that. It says the Scottish government will not have nuclear weapons, but that's hardly a revelation. It does not, however, rule out Scotland being part of a nuclear alliance, and it certainly does not rule out U.S. warships coming to Scotland with nuclear weapons on board. So actually, the indefiniteness of the nuclear question and Trident in the white paper, to me, means that this paper is trying to be a bit of an olive branch to the RUK and NATO by saying we are going to try and reach a compromise. We're not going to be unreasonable or demand certain things out of this position. We will try and reach some kind of consensually negotiated position. And actually, my view, I'm sorry if I'm going on too long,
No, it's fascinating.
Is that if you wanted to denuclearize the RUK, far better to do that. Where I disagree with some people, and see, indeed, I've had this discussion, is this view is, okay, you declare independence, you say nuclear weapons on a bus, 3 weeks later, get them out. In that case, it's far more likely the RUK not wanting to accept significant change in the short term will rebase them at great cost in England. That they will actually go to the point of view of paying to bring them down somewhere to Portsmouth or somewhere down in the sort of southwest. However, this is one of these questions about change in the RUK. If independence occurs, give the RUK time to think what it wishes to be. And my guess is that given a few years, the RUK will say, we do not wish to be a nuclear power. From internal reasons, I mean, at some point you'd say, the cost of it is simply not one we wish to bear in the future. So you'd be far more likely to actually denuclearize if you weren't hardline on Trident, because no one would want to spend the money to keep the system going.
And would NATO buy that? Will NATO be reasonably happy to accept that sort of fudge?
Well, NATO would say to the RUK, whatever you want, we will back in the negotiations. Scotland would have almost no influence. And in particular, I mean, actually, it's a country that has a rather ambiguous relationship with NATO, France, which would completely back the RUK and would want the RUK to keep nuclear weapons. The French don't want to see the RUK denuclearized. They see the United Kingdom as the closest comparison to France, economically, militarily, strategically. They, therefore, don't want this change. The French are as anti-Scottish independence probably as the Spanish because of what that would mean. So in these negotiations, Scotland, in many ways, would have to, if it wants to get anything, be willing to play ball with what the RUK and France and the US would want on nuclear questions.
Now, I've got a question here from Jenny Burnett. And I think I'm going to read it out, but then I'm going to ask you what you mean by it exactly. I don't mean to be rude, but it's a question that leads on to another question. In the event of a yes vote, would a new constitution be anything more than a reproduction of European Union treaties? What are you getting at there?
Well, the idea is that in the event of independence, there's supposed to be a written constitution, and also Scotland will be seeking to join the European Union. There's the Treaty of Rome and all the other treaties that have to be complied with. So I'm wondering to what extent Scotland will have real or no or any self-determination around drawing up a truly independent constitution for itself, given that it must comply with EU membership. So, for example, the Irish, they have a clause in their constitution that says if there's any transfer of powers, for example, then they have to have a referendum. Well, the pressure would be on Scotland not to have such a clause, wouldn't it? Because the last time the Irish had a referendum, they didn't vote the way the EU wanted them to, so they had to go back and do it again until they gave them the actual answer that was required. So it's all about really self-determination, the extent to which there will be any genuine self-determination there, and what sovereignty means, and so on.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question. I.e., what does independence mean within the context of the kind of treaties that Scotland would be signing up to if and when it gained membership of the EU. So who would like to tackle that?
I'll start. Anyway. Can I deal with your last point first? It's already the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, but it has a series of laws that amount to a constitution. It is already the case in the United Kingdom as a result of legislation passed by the current Conservative or Democrat coalition that no significant transfer of powers can now take place from Westminster to Brussels without a referendum. So we have in effect got ourselves pretty close to the Irish position without declaring independence. I think the second thing then to say is that I'm not aware, I'm starting to be corrected, that there is very much in the way of European Union requirements that would limit Scotland's freedom of choice in terms of how it decided to organise its democracy. You have to be a democracy, that's crucial to European Union membership. But whether or not we have one chamber or two, whether we have proportional representation and which variety of proportional representation, what is the relationship between the judiciary and whether we have a form of judicial review or not, all of these kind of fairly standard questions about domestic constitutions. I think the European Union already contains Heinz 57 varieties, and we would just simply be the 58th. So to that extent, at least, now obviously there's an entirely separate question, which comes back to the debate was going on south of the border between Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg about to what extent European Union membership constrains the actual laws that whatever constitutional structure you set up can pass. But that's a separate argument. That doesn't determine the structure of the internal constitution. It obviously imposes obligations on a state in terms of some of the regulation that it has to be willing to pass and to administer. But that's independent, I think, of the internal domestic process.
Magnus, can I add a point? I do want to reinforce the point that John's just made about effectively the structure of governance within Scotland. I think that we have a single chamber parliament which was set up with the expectation that there would always be a minority government, or at least no one party would have a majority of power. Now, unfortunately, that didn't work. And we now have, not unfortunately because the SNP got a majority, but unfortunately because the structure of governance was based on this expectation of the main party not being a majority party. So we don't have the same checks and balances as were anticipated. And indeed, the committee system, I would argue, with all the major committees now being chaired by an MSP from the majority party, does not provide the same checks and balances as were anticipated. Now, whether we go for independence or for further fiscal devolution, as is likely, in my view, in the event of a no vote, I think there needs to be very careful consideration as to whether the structure of governance, as we have, is fit for purpose in this new context. And I would argue that there should be careful consideration for how it can be adjusted, not with major resource costs and huge extra layers added on, but how it can be adjusted in such a way that one does have checks and balances within the democratic structure which are necessary when major decisions, more and more major decisions, are being taken by that Parliament. So I think that is what I look for in a revisiting of the Constitution, is to look at how it can be made fit for purpose for whatever scenario lies ahead of us.
Again, if anybody wants to follow up that question, indeed, if you would like to follow up on that, please do. But I just want to move it on just a little bit and ask Dr. O'Brien just to address the sort of thorny question. There's a phrase in this pamphlet book which is false legal certainties, and it applies to joining the EU, i.e. both one side says we will waltz into the EU and the other side says no, you'll have to start from scratch. And where does the truth or any legal certainty or political certainty lie in this debate?
I might be the least qualified person at the table to answer that question. I'm a political historian, and my view is that there's no legal reason Scotland can't stay in the EU. that what we're dealing with now is a political series of statements to try and keep Scotland from voting yes. That all these statements that have come out of the EU from Barroso, whatever, are politically minded statements to try and keep Scotland from becoming independent by creating uncertainty in Scottish minds about whether they would retain EU citizenship. Once Scotland votes, then the political question becomes how difficult or easy do you wish to make it to use Scotland as an example. But it seems to me that this is not, and I hope I'm not offending international lawyers in the crowd, this is not a legal question where if everyone wanted Scotland in, you're saying, well, you can't get in because legally you don't have that right. It would be one that would be handled by political negotiations between Scotland and the EU, in which, by the way, Scotland would have a very weak hand. That again, Scotland would be a supplicant in this negotiating process, which was one of the reasons Scotland would have to compromise on things like Trident, is that Scotland will want more from these negotiations than it has to offer. And it would therefore have to be, you might say, a reasonable negotiating partner.
There's a question here from Dr. Catherine Smith there, which is, I'm going to sort of just boil it down a little, if you don't mind. Basically, it's saying, as no man is an island, since Scotland geographically is equally well placed to be part of United States, Chinese, Russian, or European federations, which of these options gives an independent Scotland greatest short-term and greatest long-term economic benefits? I.e., should we just be talking about joining Europe? Why don't we sort of join Vladimir Putin and make the best of it? Is that your point?
The point is that we may find ourselves with suitors who are other than the EU because of the geographically strategic position in which we find ourselves, because of the proximity to each of these across the North Pole.
Is that likely?
Again, I'm not, but I assume independence is only conceptually possible because of the existence of the European Union anyway. I can't imagine without the existence of originally the EC, but now the EU, Scottish people would be contemplating independence. So the idea that you would have independence and go to any other group but the EU strikes me as not believable. I mean, you could try and join the United States. There actually would be no legal impediment as long as Congress wished to approve the statehood application of Scotland. But
would you allow us to be independent?
So I've lived here for 20 years. Again, I've been here longer than Sean Connery. No, I mean, no, the odd thing is Scotland has right now about the same rights as an American state. It still actually has fewer sort of devolved powers than an American state, but it's heading in that direction. So an American state would be more Devo Max. And so if you wanted Devo Max, you could get that in the USA.
I just want to follow it up with a question about security in general. Again, Dr. O'Brien, if you don't mind, to you. Security, which is absolutely critical, and there's been a lot of talk about whether Scotland would be able to defend itself. But equally, when we're talking about intelligence and security, not just in terms of troops on the ground or ships patrolling around its borders, presumably it's in the interests of the rest of the United Kingdom that Scotland shouldn't be a weak link in the security chain. So there's a sort of two-way aspect to that debate, isn't there?
Well, yes. I mean, there's what Scotland would like to be part of upon independence is what is now called Five Eyes. I don't know if that's a phrase that means much to people. That's an intelligence sharing group really amongst the English-speaking world. It's the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And it's the best and most successful intelligence sharing group. The problem Scotland would be offering something to Five Eyes upon independence, because right now it has no structure to offer any intelligence. So for the first few years, Scotland would have to find a way to say, please let us in on the hope that we can deliver in the future. Now, it's not impossible to see Scotland in Five Eyes, because one thing, and I referenced this earlier, it is interesting how New Zealand was kicked out of Five Eyes when it had its hard non-nuclear policy. But a few years ago, New Zealand was quietly ushered back into Five Eyes. There wasn't a lot said about that because of New Zealand's non-nuclear position. But now New Zealand is part of that intelligence sharing relationship. So you might say Scotland could do something like break up the United Kingdom, which Five Eyes doesn't want. Again, by the way, Canadians are not wild about breaking up a federation. So this is not anything that Five Eyes supports, or any of the Five Eyes countries want the United Kingdom to break up. But if it did happen, you could have a situation where, again, if Scotland was lucky and played its cards right and was treated well, could eventually be allowed in. In the short term, oh gosh, I mean, the whole thing about it, independence, is you hope you just become less of a target while you build up your intelligence services. I mean, that would be really all you can, because British intelligence is fabulous. It's one of the best in the world, and Scotland would only get the parts of that London would wish to hand over. So upon independence, its intelligence gathering abilities would be severely curtailed. On the other hand, it would be, as a small country, and I've had this discussion with people in London, I think it would become less of a target. So you'd hope that that one loss would be counterbalanced in the short term.
John, do you think could Scotland afford a kind of traditional defence force, or would it actually be in the kind of position of starting from a blank sheet of paper and actually deciding, instead of sort of trying to save the Scottish regiments or whatever it is, that we actually invest in a lot of drones and maybe a few coastal patrol vessels? Would that be sufficient, do you think? Could we afford?
Well, I suppose one advantage an independent Scotland has, or might have, would be an ability to rethink what it wanted in defence terms. That is not conditioned by having an existing army, an existing defence industry, and so on. On the other hand, that point is somewhat counteracted by part of the way in which this debate has been conducted so far, in which the employment provided by military activity, whether one's talking as Phillips did earlier about Faslane and the naval base there, or whether one's talking about the people who are employed in the Scottish regiments, that much of the argument right about that has not been concerned with the defence purposes of these activities, but the fact that there are a lot of people employed in Scotland in these activities at the moment who very much want to go on doing pretty much what they're doing at the moment.
Now we've unless anybody.
There's a question over there.
Oh, where? There.
Magnus, if I may take your panel back to the question of checks and balances. As Jeremy knows, it's a question I asked at some of the David Hume events. We have now a majority government, and therefore the checks and balances in some instances, as in the committees to which Jeremy's made reference, has become perhaps a little more challenging. If then there is independence and the majority party, by definition, becomes stronger, what checks and balances would the panel propose in order that we, the taxpayers, can ensure that there really are effective checks and balances? Because you will get better government with good opposition, and better government, I submit, with good checks and balances.
Before you surrender the microphone, you're talking about checks and balances in terms of constraints on a government, a majority government, or are you talking about sort of constitutional checks and balances within the Scottish Parliament, and would there be a need for a second chamber, that kind of thing?
In a sense, both. I share Jeremy's view that a second chamber would be expensive and conceivably impractical, but there needs to be, I think, some way in which there is
some new level of scrutiny and accountability, because otherwise we're on a single train going somewhere, maybe nowhere.
Jeremy, it seems to be your question.
Well, I'm not a political scientist, and I would simply say that I would want to make sure that there were some checks and balances in place, particularly in circumstances when all revenue raising, etc., was part of the Scottish Government's responsibilities. And I do worry a little about a continuation of one-party majority and one-party oversight of the key committees. Now, just as one example, there is a proposal that John Swinney has made that there should be an equivalent to the UK Office of Budget Responsibility, which sets the parameters within which budgets work. So it provides the economic forecast, and it also provides the forecast of revenue and expenditure that the government then have to take. So government doesn't do those forecasts, the OBR does, and then the Chancellor works within that set of constraints. Now, John Swinney has recommended there should be something akin to the OBR, but the options that are on the table at the moment appear to me to include one option whereby the forecasts continue to be made by government, and the OBR, Scottish OBR, which you could call sober if you wish, has the opportunity to comment on them in a transparent way. But the government still continues to make its own forecast and make its own decisions based on that. I would much prefer that something equivalent to OBR with the powers that OBR has be set up as one constraint that allows for decision-making to take place within a defined environment. Now, that's not because I don't trust whatever government might emerge, but because I think it is right and proper that there be the ability for others to comment, to constrain, and so that better decision-making results. But I'd look to the political scientists to find a way, without major resource-intensive additions to the panoply of government, whereby those checks and balances can be achieved.
Well, to go back to the first question at the beginning, the OBR came into existence because it was demonstrated that government could not be trusted.
Yeah.
Right in these areas of accurately reporting expenditure, and did exert political influence over economic forecasts.
You're being much more straightforward than me. Yes, that's right.
I mean, Magnus, I think we should be slightly careful here. We should remember that between 1999 and 2007 we had a majority government. It's simply a majority government that consisted of two parties rather than one. And I think one also needs to be slightly careful about what one says about the committees. I mean, certainly, in my experience, and I've only followed certain pieces of legislation, basically it's very, very difficult for the committees to overturn the principle of a piece of legislation that's put forward by the Scottish Government. Though corroboration may be an exception to that. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the Scottish Government is not exactly being given an easy time by the Justice Committee for its legislation on corroboration. However, what you can sometimes see, and certainly, for example, was certainly true of the bill that introduced the single transferable vote in Scottish local government, that bill was completely rewritten by the committee. Good. Not in terms of the principle. The principles were determined by the government. There was no way it's going to be overturned. But the actual detail of the legislation, the bill that emerged, was virtually completely rewritten from the beginning. So to that extent, at least, I think one should not. One should, I think, understand that the committees won't overturn the principles of government legislation. They're very unlikely to do so, but that doesn't stop them from doing valuable technical work. And secondly, remember how experience has been of majority representation on committees in 2007 to 11 was the exception. The other thing, of course, to say about this is that, for good or ill, this is not exactly a government that could be accused of a great deal of legislative activism. Now, ironically, we do have a government that has a majority, but it's not exactly using it to manifestly introduce major changes in Scotland that, or at least not major changes that may not happen anyway. I mean, I think one would argue probably the same-sex legislation would have happened irrespective of who was in power, because at the end of the day it got through on a cross-party basis anyway.
I'm sorry, we've got to move on to the last the last clump of questions, otherwise we will run out of time. And it's very, very important. This last questions are under the heading of Culture and Broadcasting, Science and Higher Education, Welfare and Public Services. And one of the questions here, which doesn't have a name attached, so I shall ask it myself. I'm going to ask Professor Diamond. It's a critical question for universities in Scotland. It's the one that's asked again and again. What are the options for science and higher education funding post-referendum? Because this raises the whole issue of things like whether universities would still have access to the UK Research Council.
Sure, thank you very much. I mean, I think the first thing just to say is that we have a wonderful system of higher education in Scotland, and governments and parties of all political persuasions, both in Westminster and in Holyrood, have been committed fully to supporting that. So I think regardless of the vote in September, there will be a commitment to a very strong higher education system. Let me just look at the ways in which higher education could be impacted. Firstly, there's been a lot of talk about the impact of undergraduate fees in England. I have to say that, as far as I'm aware, neither in Westminster nor in Holyrood do we yet have a one-party state. And therefore there will be elections in 2015 and 2016, and therefore it is likely or unlikely, depending on the results, that we may have different higher education policies with regard to fees in England, and indeed Scotland has a history of having had graduate endowments or whatever. So I do think that for higher education, the issue of undergraduate fees is something that universities will just manage regardless of whichever party is in power. The second issue is research, and currently Scottish universities have access to the research councils in England, which they apply for very successfully for competitively won research funding. What would happen in the event of a yes vote? Well, I have heard it said that the UK would treat Scotland as any other European country in this situation. Well, the research councils over the last 10 years have been negotiating relationships with other European countries to enable researchers to work together across jurisdictions without having to go through what one would call the double jeopardy of having to apply for the same research grant to two different countries. And now we have that at the moment in the UK. Scholars from the University of Edinburgh can work with scholars from the University of Cambridge, for example, and apply for the same research grant. We would need, hopefully, to move into a position where we could negotiate such an opportunity. The third area that I think is important is that in order to maintain a high-class higher education system in Scotland, we need to be able to recruit the very best staff from across the world, and to do so in a very strong global higher education market, and that needs a very favourable immigration policy, as does for the recruitment of international students who play an enormous role, not only in the short term on the economy of Scotland and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom, but in the long term through both soft and hard power for the country. So we would need, therefore, I think, strong immigration policies. Fundamentally, all this could be achieved with the commitment of governments. And I have to say we've been privileged, as I said at the beginning, by successive prime ministers in Westminster and successive Scottish governments who have been supportive and seen the need for a strong higher education system right across the United Kingdom, and particularly for this case in Scotland. We would need that commitment, and we would also need an economy in Scotland which was enabled to have the money to fund such a system and to be able to put the money into research for that research to be able to carry it out.
Do you go along with that generally sort of optimistic view about it, or are there some high risks over the horizon? For instance, why should a UK Research Council, which is no longer as Scotland, as part of it, hand out money to Scottish universities.
Well, I don't think. Can I just say, I specifically didn't say that, Magnus.
No.
So,
I did.
well, you did, but I mean, but let's be clear. One is not expecting a UK Research Council to hand out money to Scottish institutions in the event of independence in exactly the same way as a UK Research Council does not hand out normally money to French institutions. What one is saying, and that's very clearly what I said at the end, was one would require a Scottish government which had an economy which was able to and wished to invest in research to have a system whereby it was investing in research, and one would want to be able to have a relationship with UK Research Council, or rest of UK research councils, which enabled scholars in England, Wales and Northern Ireland to work seamlessly with scholars in Scotland. And all the evidence is that enabling that to happen is very, very good for scholars in Scotland, but it is also very, very good for scholars in the rest of the United Kingdom. So we would all want that to happen.
Just a couple of comments, Magnus, if you like. I mean, I totally endorse Ian's emphasis on the importance of the higher education sector in Scotland and the great contribution it makes and must continue to make. I think it is absolutely critical to our success. I think on the research side, Scottish higher education has been remarkably successful in punching well above its weight in terms of the extent of research funding it has achieved from the different research councils. And I hope that it can continue to find the funds through one form or another in order to continue to undertake high-level research in the various higher education institutions. I also agree very much about the point about immigration. I think that separate work has been done on immigration, some of which is referred to in this book and is continuing. I think a separate immigration policy of some sort in an independent policy, in an independent Scotland, or potentially in a further devolved Scotland, may be very important as part of the way the economy works and society works. But the other point I would make, though, is coming back to your question, is that Scotland will have to make, whether under independence or under further fiscal devolution, very tough decisions on the public finances as to how it finances, whether it be defence, whether it be higher education fees, whether it be research. It's going to have to make very tough decisions. And I think that it will mean looking afresh at a number of areas, determining priorities and determining how to afford what is appropriate for Scotland going forward. And that means starting anew in a number of areas at looking at them. And I'm not saying that we can't afford to have fee-free higher education, or we can't afford to finance the research we need, but it's going to be tough choices that will have to be made within the context of the public finances as we can expect them. And that, to me, is crucial, that we start and look carefully at our choices. And one last point is that I want more and more our higher education sector to work with business and business to work with our higher education sector, so we actually get the benefits from this research that's undertaken flowing through more and more to new and dynamic and growing businesses in Scotland, which doesn't happen enough. We've got insufficient innovation by business based on the marvellous research that's going in universities, because as yet the interaction between business and higher education is not as it should be. It's very good in some areas, but it's not good. We've got marvellous higher education research and development, and we've got very disappointing business investment in research and development. And having those two cheek by jowl in one nation is not good, and it must not continue.
Peace is breaking out between Jeremy and I.
Yes, I was about to break it up, but there's another question from the back there.
This is very interesting, but I mean, what in fact I think Ian Diamond is saying is that with luck, and if we can just everything works out financially and economically and so on, we can just about stay where we are if Scotland split off from the UK. At the moment, as Ian said, and I totally agree with him, the Scottish universities and indeed the English university system is doing extremely well, internationally. It has few competitors that are ahead of it, apart from in the States and some very good examples elsewhere. But the question really was, right at the end of Ian's remarks, that if Scotland, if we did split, then would there be sufficient money in the kitty to maintain these kind of interactions? At the moment, with the Union, we can afford it. It has happened. It's happened for decades and is going very well. So I'm really asking, what on earth is all this about from the point of view of universities? It seems to be really uncertain that we can survive, and yet we can't survive the way we are in the Union at the moment. So why separate? What's the interest in separating?
I think that's posing, Professor Dine, with a highly political question, which he may or may not want to answer.
I repeat what I said. Yes, it's certainly, it's about the economy, isn't it? And it's then, as Jeremy's rightly said, about the economy and in any environment, the amount of money that the public is prepared, or the government is prepared to put into higher education. Higher education at the moment, the Scottish Government has supported extremely well. In the UK Government has supported the research councils at a time of austerity by maintaining their funding and the ring fence within BIS. That huge support has happened for a very long time. The question I have, and I see, not the question, the point I make, is that I see no way in which that is likely to change, because all the economics suggest that if you want to invest in anything, one of the best things to invest in is undergraduate education if you're trying to drive forward the GDP. As Jeremy is saying, investing in research is also a good thing. One of the reasons that Prime Ministers and Chancellors have supported the investment of public money in research over the last decades has been the empirical evidence from other countries that where there has been an extremely high investment in research, then those countries' GDP have followed. Now, I agree with Jeremy that we really need to make sure that we get the link between not only research and the economy, but research and society more generally really well put together. And I've seen no evidence that governments don't want that to happen. But at the end of the day, it is a political decision against all sorts of other things as to what you spend the money on.
Question here.
Thank you. You referred to the research in bodies, councils, but even more than they contribute to research in the Scottish universities is provided by British companies, Glaxo's, Unilever, all of these people. Will they, if they are based, as they will continue to be based in England, be prepared to donate large, and I mean very large, sums of money to Scotland?
Well, certainly. I think it's a very, very important and good point. The major charities have remained silent at the moment, as I see it, and clearly funding from the Wellcome Trust, Cancer Research UK, is terribly important to Scottish universities. My view of private companies is that they tend to go where the very best research is, and they would make decisions based on the research that is able to give them best shareholder value. And that's why it's unbelievably important that we in Scottish higher education maintain the quality of our staff to be able to compete internationally for those money. Much of the work that we do at the moment in Scotland is with companies not based in the UK. We need to maintain that, and we need an incredibly strong higher education system so that we can compete in a very strong global market for that company money.
I know there are two more or more questions on this, but we've only got 10 more minutes, and there are some other questions within this umbrella. And John Elliott John Elliott, there he is. His question is, does the panel anticipate that an independent Scotland would or would be able to provide levels of funding for the arts similar to those available at present?
It's a question for you, Magnus, isn't it?
Oh, I very much
Go for it,
I
Magnus.
don't think I'm allowed to answer questions. But it's a wider question, isn't it? Because it depends on where the priorities of an independent Scotland would lie. Any clues in the white paper or elsewhere as to whether the arts would enjoy a higher priority in an independent Scotland?
The one thing that I think we probably would be aware of is that if Scotland were to become independent, and certainly if Scotland were to be run by the current administration, there would be a keenness to fund artistic activity that was thought in some way or another to promote Scotland. I think there would certainly be a wish to see domestic Scottish arts being promoted in particular, and I think certainly some people in the nationalist movement think that at the moment distinctive Scottish culture is not necessarily adequately promulgated and promoted within the existing structure. And obviously certainly one of the reasons why some people, for example, inside the nationalist movement would prefer to see public broadcasting run by an organisation other than the BBC is again a belief that if Scotland would have its own public television service, that again would ensure that rather more in the way of distinctively Scottish output would be available than is currently the case. So I think certainly that's the orientation. Now, whether or not that means other things get squeezed out, that's much more debatable. I think it's probably difficult to believe, for example, that certainly some of those aspects of Scottish artistic life, which are international, such as the Edinburgh International Festival, are not going to continue to be funded because, hey guys, it's a pretty good way of getting tourists to come here, and I think any Scottish government will probably recognise the value of that.
There are 2 points here, really. One is, would there be more or less money in independent Scotland? And the second is, what would be the priorities of an independent Scotland? I can say just a word on each of these issues. The first question is one that is for many people a central economic issue in the debate. And the answer to that is, I think, as far as the fiscal position is concerned, in the short run, there is probably a rough equivalence, on average, between the extent to which public expenditure financed through the block grant and the Barnett formula is today higher in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK as a result of that funding system, as against the increased revenue which Scotland would derive as a result of receiving a disproportionate share of North Sea oil revenues. We can't describe exactly how that balance would work out in practice, partly because it's complicated, partly because it's volatile, but there's probably a rough match. It wouldn't make a large amount of difference either way. In the medium term, that position probably deteriorates, and it deteriorates for 2 reasons. One is the oil is almost certainly a declining source of revenue, and the other is that demography, which is a big factor driving balance between government revenue and expenditure, deteriorates and does so rather more in Scotland than it does in the rest of the UK. The bigger question, however, is clearly whether economic growth would be faster or slower in independent Scotland. And I can run that argument plausibly either way. I can present the argument that says we could do some of the offsetting, the loss of corporate headquarters activity. We could visualise a more self-confident, vibrant business community in Scotland in an independence world than we have otherwise. We could also tell a story in which a rather unpleasant combination of kind of crony capitalism and dull municipal socialism leads to a disappointing rate of growth in Scotland. And for me, the choice between which of these two one thinks more likely is probably the largest economic issue in the independence debate. The second group of issues are to do with priorities. And in economic terms, we've got to start talking priorities. I thought the most depressing thing about the government white paper on independence was it consisted very largely of a wish list of desirable policies, and most of which, in fact, the Scottish government currently does have the power to do, but does not have the money to do. And that debate is not about independence, if that's the case. It's about, we wish we could find some money growing on trees somewhere. And unfortunately, the bottom line in economic terms is that money does not grow on trees. We're arguing here about priorities. We've been talking about things all of us, or many of us, would like the Scottish government to spend more on. But the corollary of spending more on some things is that you spend less on others. And if we're to talk about how independence would be different, we need to think not just about what we would like to do, but what we would have to stop doing. And that gets to be a serious debate, one we need to have.
Well, I think that's actually a pretty good note on which to end, and indeed we are absolutely up to our deadline. Chair, 1955, Chair concludes. So that's exactly what I propose to do. I propose to conclude it by saying that I think that what's been quite interesting about this evening's discussion, and indeed what emerges from this, is that some of the issues that have been very put in a highly political way, but in a very sort of black and white way, turn out on closer examination to be far less clear than perhaps people had assumed. And I think it explains why, when you start talking about this issue, it is amazing how many people still ask the question, I wish I had more information on which to base my decision. What they mean by that, I think, is that what they have heard so far is just arguments from one side or another, put for highly political reasons, inevitably, to gain a yes or a no vote. And what people desperately want is something that they can latch onto and be reasonably confident in. And the question over there about, how can we believe if chancellors are not being sort of honest and open, who can we trust? Well, it is a highly political debate, and you have to treat it with some caution. But I do think that in this volume, there's an honesty about it. It accepts the fact that there are certain questions that cannot be answered with the clarity that people want until after the vote, until a decision is reached. Only then will that negotiation begin. Only then will some of these things become absolutely clear. But nevertheless, in the run-up to the referendum, you could certainly do worse than, I was going to say plough through, that's the wrong word. Get to grips with this extremely important volume, which has some very important information in it. So I hope that you will read it with interest. And in the meantime, all I can do is thank the RSE very much for this enlightening debate, the British Academy as well. Enlightening is a good word to use in the context of Edinburgh, of course, and it does enlighten. And equally, I want to thank our panel this evening for providing such a fascinating response to the various questions asked. So perhaps you would just join me in thanking the panel.